Okay, so um, let's dive straight into this. We've got some material here that feels, well, really relevant right now.
Definitely. It ties global tensions, stuff happening overseas, directly to concerns, closer to home, even looks at the tech being built.
Yeah, it kicks off pretty intensely, talking about recent events, specifically that Israeli strike on Iran,
Right, and the source we're looking at, they frame it as a prediction they actually made coming true.
which is interesting in itself.
Hmm.
But what struck me is how they don't just leave it there as some isolated foreign conflict.
No, not at all. They immediately start connecting it back to underlying fears, structural issues they see happening domestically.
All the way down to the technology they believe is, like, shaping our future. It's quite a thread they pull.
Exactly. So, for everyone listening, this deep dive is exploring a conversation. It's between Matt Smith and Doug Casey from an article called Iran Conflict and Palantir Surveillance State.
And it's definitely layered. You get this mix of real-time geopolitical takes, some pretty strong policy critiques, and then this deep look at surveillance infrastructure.
So, our job here really is to guide you through all this. It's dense stuff. We want to pull out what the source argues are the key insights.
Yeah, try to understand their perspective on what's really going on behind, the daily headlines.
We'll look at their specific claims, some pretty alarming connections they draw, honestly, and unpack the predictions they make.
So just to set the scene a bit more, the source opens by revisiting a prediction they'd apparently made earlier about a confrontation between Israel and Iran.
And they point straight to that recent Israeli strike as basically proof, confirmation that their forecast was, well, accurate in their view.
Okay, so starting with that geopolitical event. The source makes a pretty potent argument about the U.S.-Israel dynamic, doesn't
Oh,
it?
yeah. They claim that, look, despite official denials, Israel's actions are fundamentally linked to the U.S., tied together.
And they use that really provocative metaphor to illustrate it.
Right, the battered man, that's the U.S. in their analogy with a vicious dog. That's Israel attacking Iran. It's strong language.
Very strong.
Mhm.
And following that, they talk about U.S. plausible deniability in these kinds of situations.
Their take, globally, it's just seen as theater. Like the world perceives it as a total pretense. They can see right through it.
Okay. And this critical view, it extends to political figures, too. Doug Casey, who the source points out used to be supportive.
Yeah, he expresses what sounds like really deep disillusionment with Donald Trump, just lays into him.
What kind of things?
Well, the source quotes him attributing things like megalomania, pathological lying, psychological instability to the former president.
Wow. And highlighting contradictions.
Exactly, like advocating for peace, but then, simultaneously okaying military actions, that kind of thing. It's a sharp critique from a former supporter.
And stepping back even further, the source doesn't stop there. It levels this broad critique against mainstream media, too.
Right across the board, basically. From Al Jazeera to Fox News, their argument is they're all biased, all compromised.
The contention being that the news we get is essentially, third hand?
Hmm.
Because of government influence shaping it all.
That's the idea they put forward, that the narrative is heavily managed.
So shifting slightly,
Yeah.
what about the Iranian response to that initial Israeli strike? How does the source see that?
From their perspective, pretty impotent so far. They talk about the slow-moving drones, how they were neutralized before even reaching targets. That's the assessment in the source.
But they also mention tactical sophistication on the Israeli side in that first strike.
Yeah, they allege Israel used civilian aircraft, kind of like camouflage during the attack. The idea being it was meant to hinder Iran's defenses.
And this whole exchange, it leads them to express some significant fear about escalation, right?
Huge fear. The source suggests these tactics, especially what they call decapitation strikes.
Meaning targeting top leaders.
Exactly, targeting top military leaders. They worry that could potentially be aimed at Russia next.
And Casey predicts this style of warfare, targeting leadership, might become like the main way conflicts are fought going forward.
That's his prediction, yeah. A dominant form of warfare.
Okay, now this is where the conversation in the source takes quite a turn, connecting all this international stuff back home to the U.S.
Right, a sharp pivot. They dive into fears about organized riots, civil unrest actually happening within the U.S.
And they link this directly to border policy.
That's the explicit link Matt Smith makes in the source. He suggests potential sleeper agents might have entered the U.S. during what he calls an open border period.
Which culminates in a very direct warning.
Oh, yeah. Basically, Netflix and chill. Stay home, avoid public events, public gatherings.
And they even flag a specific date, June 14th, as a point of potential concern.
They do. It's quite specific and, frankly, a bit chilling.
So how does technology fit into all this? This is where Palantir enters the picture, the all-seeing eye, as the source calls it.
Right. Palantir. So the source explains it was founded back in 2003, Peter Thiel, with initial backing from the CIA. That's the origin story they present.
And the name itself, Palantir, is from Tolkien, Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, those seeing stones, the Palantir, used to see things far away, even through time sometimes.
Pretty evocative name for a tech company.
Extremely. And the source argues it's fitting because Palantir's core mission, as they state it, is to centralize, well, all data.
All data. What does that encompass, according to them?
They make it clear they mean everything. Government records, corporate data, social media stuff, your personal photos, biometric records, everything.
Wow. The argument is Palantir is built to just vacuum it all up and connect it.
That's the picture painted. And their client list, according to the source, governments U.S., Israel, Ukraine are named, plus major corporations.
Okay, this leads to probably one of the source's most provocative claims about the company.
Which is?
They argue Palantir is essentially a fascist infrastructure.
Right. And they base that on Doug Casey invoking Mussolini's definition of fascism, the merger of state power and corporate power.
And the source contends Palantir is a perfect example of this. Private company, huge profits, deeply embedded with state power.
And ultimately working against the interests of ordinary citizens. That's the core of their argument there. It's a very strong claim.
Definitely. So connecting Palantir back to politics, the source points fingers at the previous administration, the Trump administration.
Yeah, they argue that administration helped Palantir grow, helped embed it deeper into government systems.
They mentioned something specific, Project Doge.
That's the one.
Yeah.
Allegedly, it was meant to streamline government, make things more efficient. But the source's take is that it just served to integrate Palantir even more deeply into how the state operates.
Which feeds into this wider argument they make about political hypocrisy.
How so?
Well, the source claims that administration talked a lot about reducing state power, shrinking government.
Yeah, that was the rhetoric.
But the actual policies, they argue, increased centralized surveillance power, expanded the bureaucracy's reach through tech like this.
Ah, I see. So the actions contradicted the words, in their view.
Exactly. And they offer this really crucial warning based on this infrastructure being built up.
Which is
Even if the president now doesn't fully use Palantir's power, the next one probably will.
because once you have a tool, you use it.
Yeah.
That's the principle they keep coming back to in the source.
Yeah. That really sticks with you. And Peter Thiel himself, Palantir's founder, he gets a critical look too.
How's he portrayed?
Well, the source identifies him as, supposedly a libertarian, but they depict him as someone corrupted by power.
Building infrastructure that's fundamentally opposed to libertarian ideals. Is that the gist?
That's exactly the argument presented, a kind of ultimate contradiction.
And there's another layer they add, connecting Thiel to the Bilderberg Group.
Yeah, they mention he's on its steering committee.
Okay. And they talk about topics supposedly on the Bilderberg agenda, like depopulation and migration.
Right. And the source uses this to fuel concern about, possible covert global initiatives. It taps into those broader anxieties.
It's weaving a lot of threads together here.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And it doesn't stop there. The source brings in speculation about long-term health impacts from the COVID vaccines.
Okay. How does that connect?
Well, they make a point of highlighting that Deborah Birx, who led Operation Warp Speed, the vaccine rollout program, is now on Palantir's board.
Ah. And the source sees that as what? Revolving door corruption?
Pretty much. Evidence of this concerning link between government health initiatives and these powerful private tech firms collecting data.
Got it. And then shifting back again to domestic cultural issues.
Yeah, the source talks about what they perceive as cultural decline in the U.S., growing worry about immigrant-driven unrest, ideological programming, those sorts of concerns.
Do they give specific examples?
They mention rising irredentism, the idea that territory historically belonging to one country should be returned. Specifically, they bring up the Reconquista narrative. This view, held by some Mexican activists, is about reclaiming the U.S. Southwest.
Wow, okay. That's a specific cultural friction point they're highlighting.
And finally, they level this really strong accusation against NGOs, non-governmental organizations.
What's the charge?
They argue many NGOs are basically state-funded engines driving cultural erosion.
State-funded, meaning taxpayer money.
That's their point,
Yeah.
that these groups often get public funds, which, in the source's view, makes ordinary citizens kind of complicit in cultural changes they might not even agree with.
Okay, that's a lot.
It really is. So if you put it all together, the picture this source paints is, well, pretty bleak.
Yeah, you've got this potential surveillance dystopia via Palantir, a foreign policy they think is just fueling chaos globally, and then serious domestic instability and fragmentation.
The feeling they leave you with is like, there's no easy exit, like being in a plane with no ripcord for the parachute.
It's definitely a challenging perspective they offer. So the key takeaways from this source for you listening.
I mean, first is the strong connection they draw between what happens globally, what happens domestically, right down to the tech.
Absolutely. Then there's the growing power of this centralized surveillance tech, like Palantir, and how they argue it's blurring the lines between state and corporate power.
And underneath it all, this deep, deep skepticism about pretty much everything, media, government, certain organizations. It runs through the whole conversation.
It really does.
So maybe the final thought to leave you with, building on that point the source makes, that any powerful tool, once it exists, tends to get used eventually.
Right. And combining that with their concerns about just how much data is being centralized, the potential for misuse, maybe by a future administration.
It really poses a fundamental question, doesn't it? If the infrastructure gets built to see and collect essentially all data.
What really protects individual liberties then? What safeguards are left?
And who ultimately gets to decide how a tool that powerful is actually deployed?
Yeah. Definitely something to think about long after this deep dive is over.